your bees haven't swarmed yet. I know there've been swarms down in London. But if we let Jane start tonight, Jane Medwell is a trustee.
Okay. No.
Are you ready to share, Jane?
I'm ready to share. Let me see. Microsoft PowerPoint. Here we are. Share. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jane Medwell, the BBKA Trustees, and I'm going to take a very simple approach to swarming. I have to point out I haven't taken this photo this year yet, but it's another funny year, isn't it? We had a very cold spring last year, and it's becoming a feature of my life to come back from the spring convention prepared to do my first inspection rather than having for the spring convention as I used to do. And when I did my first inspections last weekend, I was quite surprised by how advanced the bees were. And I think I've got clear evidence that they're not only paying attention to the weather, but also to day length, because a lot of them were ready to swarm. In this talk, I want to talk about why bees swarm and why we want to stop them in a rather short form. I'm going to talk about the two key things you need to remember to be effective in your swarm control. I'm calling them key principles. And I'm going to romp through 3 easy swarm control methods and then talk a little bit about what you can do if you actually can't find your queen. And I hope that some of this is useful to some of you. Well, swarming. It's how our favourite superorganism reproduces. Bees are a superorganism. Individually, bees are not terribly bright. They're not great decision makers. But collectively, they're absolutely amazing. And like a superorganism, they show almost mammalian characteristics. And one of those is that they reproduce infrequently and at great cost to the colony. So when a colony is at its peak and swarms, that is the colony reproducing. It's a totally natural feature of their life cycle. And yet it costs them a great deal. They lose many of their bees, and the chances of survival of any swarm are quite low. Tom Seeley says less than 25% of swarms survive the following spring. As favourite superorganism produces through swarming, and bees are always going to swarm. Swarming starts well before launch date. They start preparing, the scout bees start checking out possible locations, and they do things like slim down their queen, they stop feeding her, and they start doing these ventrodorsal vibrations where they sort of bounce her. A prime swarm will take 50 to 70% of the bees in a colony, so it's a pretty dramatic event. And it isn't just one swarm in which they find their final location. As we know, they'll usually go to a location quite near the colony, but then later on they'll find a location further away. Bees don't want to swarm very close to home. And this picture, I don't know if you can see it or whether you're seeing my gallery. This picture is kindly given to me by my friend Barry Meachard, whose neighbour received a swarm handily on the shopping trolley he uses to put out his washing. This was one of the easiest swarms to collect. You simply lifted the shopping trolley up by the handle, banged it down over a polynuke, and the whole swarm dropped in. Hopefully, though, we're going to talk about how not to get to this state this evening. Okay, when do bees swarm? Well, I've put the lupins in because my mum always used to say the bees swarmed when the lupins flowered. All I can say is that global warming must have changed things because there are no lupins around now and yet the bees are making swarm preparations. They swarm when the weather and day length are right for them. They swarm when the queen is getting old and producing less queen substance, something we've known about since Bailey in the 1950s. Queen mandibular pheromone holds the colony together. They swarm when the colony gets large, and so it has the potential to swarm. But being larger also makes it crowded, so that the queen mandibular pheromone may not be shared as well as it was before. In short, they swarm when the colony is decided, and that decision-making process is a miracle in itself. I really commend Thomas Seeley's work on this to you. And if you do a search on Google about swarm decision-making, you'll now find it's spawned a whole set of programs modeled on the way bees make decisions. But once a colony is decided and prepared to swarm, it will commit to it and go. I'm supposing, of course, that the queen can fly. Sometimes if you've clipped the queen, a swarm will issue, queen may return with it or may be lost, and the rest will just return to the hive. But they will go at some point. So clipping doesn't prevent swarming permanently, but it does make it slightly more convenient because you can usually collect them easily. This is a video of a swarm that I put up. Work is it? Oh, don't you love video on Zoom? Right, forget it. Yeah, because when you're in a swarm, it sort of almost blocks out the light and is terribly dramatic. And that buzzing ought to be alarming, and yet isn't, because the bees are all narked up. They're all flying around in a benevolent crowd looking for where they're going. If you haven't stood out when the bees are swarming, I strongly advise it. It's fascinating. But perhaps we don't need to prevent it. Somebody said to me the other day, I let mine go because I'm in the countryside and they don't cause any problems. And I very politely and silently just gnashed my teeth at her, because I'm a beekeeper not that far from where she lives. And if her bees are in good nick, maybe it's fine. But if her bees are carrying any disease, it's very likely that swarming will bring them nearer to me. And therefore, swarmed colonies can present a disease risk to beekeepers. Incidentally, this picture is a bee tree I saw when walking in the Cotswolds. And if you peer at the dark brown bit, you can see that it's full of bees. I just walked beneath it and heard them buzzing, kind of unmistakable. Somebody told me, again, somebody who's very near to my apiary, I have bait hives, so I catch my own swarms. And I feel that if I'm catching swarms that aren't mine, mine are feeding somebody else's bait hives. I'm doing a reciprocal job. I don't think it works that way. I suspect that bait hives in your own apiary don't catch your own swarms, because swarming bees want to get out of the area that they were in, but it might draw other swarms into the apiary. And somebody told me the other day that they're repopulating feral honeybee colonies, which are an advantage to the species. Well, they might be, but more likely they're not. Few feral colonies survive. Many of them are constantly replaced by swarms coming
double sound
from apiaries. Oh, I'm hearing other people here. Another reason to prevent swarms. Well, again, my mum used to say a swarm in May is worth a field of hay, a swarm in June's worth a silver spoon, and a swarm in July ain't worth a fly. We've heard that so many times, and this little graphic from Shirley and Richard Bond shows us why. You can see that the blue line at the top would be the full colony development of adult bees, but the pink line is what happens when they've swarmed. And the bit between them is the foragers lost from the parent colony, not just as foragers, but also the brood break it causes. So if your bees swarm in May, you may lose a lot of your crop through the summer. So we want to prevent swarming for our own selfish reasons. We'd quite like them to build up a large honey surplus for us to take. This is something somebody said to me. I just removed the queen cells. That prevents swarms. Well, it probably prevents them for a few days, but not longer than that. And you can probably get away with removing queen cells once, maybe even twice. But if they want to swarm, they will swarm. Removing the queen cells does not prevent swarming. I often get calls where people, particularly our beginners, say, my bees have swarmed. I don't think there's a queen cell or eggs in the old colony. And we know a simple answer for that, don't we? If you put in a frame of eggs and young larvae, if there are no eggs and young larvae in that colony and there's no queen there, then the bees will draw out queen cells. And if they don't, the queen's there and you just can't find her. And I hear this one all the time. My queen's disappeared and I've got sealed queen cells, but there are so many bees that they can't have swarmed. I'm just taking off these queen cells, which always makes my heart sink, because at her peak, the queen is producing 1,500 to 2,000 eggs a day. It's very hard to see from the quantity of bees whether a colony is swarmed. Now, if they have swarmed and you take away the queen cells, you might be taking away everything they can produce a really good queen from. So that one always makes me think, if you see queen cells, stop and think about your options before you proceed. Now, some people tell me they have swarmy bees, and I've been thinking a lot about this. What's a swarmy colony of bees? Well, all bees swarm. Any strain of bees that doesn't swarm will shortly become extinct. But bees that swarm might be bees that don't have enough space for either bees or honey. Maybe they need a bigger box. It might be where all the brood frames are full. If there's no egg-laying space, then that probably signals to the colony, really, it's time to reproduce. We need to get this queen out and somewhere else. Or maybe the queen is a bit subpar. She's aging, she's producing less queen mandibular pheromone, and so it's not holding the colony together as well, and they're starting to think about replacing her. Some strains of bees are said to swarm more often. And if that's the case, well, then requeening is probably your best bet. It may be as simple as your colony is in peak condition, it's at its best, it's ready to reproduce. So the concept of swarmy bees is a difficult one. I wouldn't expect bees to swarm more than once a year. And if they did, I'd look at all these things to see whether we could give them a bit more space, whether they need requeening, and think about it. Why do we prevent swarming? Well, that ought to be, how do we prevent swarming? This lovely little graphic from Adam Tofilsky is a slice through a developing queen cell. And I hope you all know these numbers, but if you don't, these are the numbers to know. It's 3 days an egg, isn't it? So on that 4th day, any female diploid egg can become a queen. It just needs to be fed royal jelly by the larvae and fed often. Queen cells are fed between 4 and 8 days. They're fed 1,500 times as opposed to 150 times for an ordinary worker cell. So feeding makes a huge difference. And day 4 is when you need that feeding to start for the best quality queen. Day 8 is when the bees seal that queen cell, day 8 to 9. So you've got that window between 4 and 8 where you've got open queen cells, you know they're going to swarm, but they haven't gone yet because they usually go on day 8 to 9 when the queen cell is sealed. Once you've got a sealed queen cell, then you've got until day 16 when she emerges, and she'll take a few days to mature and then mate, and then a few days to recuperate from a few mating flights, and she'll start laying. Remember the important numbers. Day 4 is becoming a larva day and getting fed queen raw jelly. Day 8 and 9 is sealing the queen cell, and day 16 is emerging, and about 21 additional days to get mated. So those are the numbers to remember, and if we know those, everything is possible. But that gap between 4 and 8 is our special gap, and we'll keep coming back to that. Now, we recognize queen cells. The ones on the left are quite clearly swarm cells, aren't they? And they're capped. They're beautiful, they're big, they're dimply, they have every expectation of a high quality queen. The ones in the middle, now some people would say, oh, well, they're clearly supersedure cells because they're on the face of the frame. I would be more circumspect. I think supersedure tends to be an autumn thing, and I wouldn't take any chances if I had cells like that in the colony. Well, they're sealed, so it's a bit late. And the ones on the right are what we call emergency queen cells. Can you see that they're stubbier and little? And they are formed from a worker cell where the bees have needed a queen desperately, and so they've pulled out the cell to the vertical, because having a vertical cell is what stimulates them to feed royal jelly and make a queen. And so the queens there might come from larvae that are a bit older than we'd like. They might not be quite as good. So you get to your colony this weekend and you've got queen cells. What do? Well, the first thing is don't panic.
I'll see you in the morning. Love ya.
Stop.
Night.
Think. Take a step back. Remember your numbers? That those queen cells will be capped at day 8 or 9. If they're capped, you might be a bit late. But consider your options before you act hastily. Ask yourself, do I want to start another colony, make increase? Because that's going to affect your choice of swarm control method. What kit have I got? That's going to affect your choice of swarm control method. You might actually just want to walk away in order to make yourself a box of frames. And what space do I have in my apiary? Have I got enough space to do a horizontal approach to swarm control, or am I in a very tight space and I have to go up? All those help you make the decision about which approach to swarm control works for you on that particular day. Now, all of those approaches to swarm control, though, will use a couple of key principles, and I'm going to set those into a number of methods of swarm control. The first principle is about having 3 parts to a colony. We have the brood and nurse bees, which form one element of a colony of honeybees. We have the queen, a very important element of a colony of honeybees, and we have the flying foraging bees, which are a different element of the colony, and one that's been outside and is spatially geolocated to the location of the hive. Now, the first principle I'm going to introduce is remove one of those 3 components of the colony to prevent the colony swarming. Let's remove the queen. We're going to go through making up a nucleus colony, and that's usually the first technique we teach everybody because it's simple, it doesn't demand too much kit, and there are lots of things you can do with the nucleus colony. Now, making a nuke is really simple. First, you locate the queen, then you put a frame of brood with the queen on into a nuke box, and I've chosen a picture of a nice wooden one there, but let's be honest, most of us are using polys. You add a couple of frames of stores and lots of nurse bees. shake extra nurse bees off other frames, add some drawn comb or foundation, and I move the nuke away from the original colony with its entrance facing a different way from the original colony. And I put a little bit of loose grass in the entrance because that stops lots of bees flying out, but it wilts after a day and leaves them free space to go in and out. Let's go through that. Making a nuke for swarm control. You need a nucleus box with a feeder, some frames of drawn comb or foundation, and I always wish I had more drawn comb, but I usually have foundation, and some syrup to feed them. So, day one, you go to your colony, and this is a nice colony. It's got a super on the top and a queen excluder, but it's full of queen cells, although the queen is still there. First of all, we're going to take the super and the roof and the queen excluder off to give us access to the brood box with its queen and its queen cells. And then I'm going to put a nice new nuke box. Why have I chosen light green? Well, that's like my pollies. I'm going to move the queen on one frame of brood into that nuke box, but I'm going to check that frame of brood really carefully. I don't want any queen cells on there, because if I leave a queen cell in my nuke, it will just swarm, okay? So I check it really carefully. That's one frame of brood and the queen. And I can put more frames of brood or not, but as long as there's a frame of brood there and the queen, we're good. I usually add another frame of brood, a frame of stores, and nurse bees. I shake comb into there so that I've got at least an extra comb of nurse bees, sometimes two. And then I make up the space, ideally with drawn comb in the nuke, but foundation will do, and more drawn comb in the old colony. So at the moment, what I've got is the old colony, just exactly where it was when I first saw it this morning, but I've taken one frame of, a couple of frames of brood out with the queen and some stores, and I've put those into the nuke with a couple of frames of drawn comb. In the old colony, I've closed up the frames of brood, but all the queen cells are still there. Now, I'm going to feed my nuke because it's quite vulnerable and it needs to pull out, it might need to pull out some extra wax there. And I'm probably going to move that nuke so that it's facing a different direction from the old colony and put that bit of springy grass in the entrance. And then I'm going to turn my attention to the old colony. Did you see I've removed all the queen cells except for one, that pink one at the bottom? That's going to be my queen. Then I close it up and leave them to get on with it. Now I've put the super back on the old colony over a queen excluder. And in the old colony, I've got one queen cell, most of the old brood, and of course the flying bees are coming back to it, and those frames of foundation. In the nucleus colony, I've got a couple of frames of brood, a frame of stores, a couple of frames of foundational drawn comb, and they're being fed with syrup. So I've done that manipulation on the day that I found all those queen cells, and I'm going to leave them to get on with it. But here's our second key principle. We only want the colony to raise one queen cell to become a queen, but they're going to build emergency cells. So you need to remove emergency cells, and we need to think about our numbers as to when you should do this. Well, if the queen was laying eggs just before I removed her from the old colony into that nuke, those eggs will be hatching out 3 days from the manipulation day. And they'll be fed royal jelly on day 4, and they could turn into queen cells. So from day 4, there could be more queen cells. And at day 8, those would be sealed. So day 8 would be too late, and day 4 would be too early to remove those queen cells. So ideally, days 5 to 7, you should go back, check the old colony, and remove any emergency queen cells, leaving your chosen queen cell. And I'm choosing to do this 7 days later. So I'm checking the old colony, but I'm aware that the nuke's got a queen in, or I might have transferred some eggs in with the frame of brood that I transferred in. So I also check the nuke and remove all the queen cells 7 days later. And now I can feel quite secure because the old colony's got my one very pink queen cell to hatch out into a queen, and the new colony, my little nuke, has got the old queen. And after 3 weeks, I'd like to think, that's 3 weeks plus the 7 days, so 28 days, I'd like to think there would be a mated queen. But my experience tells me that many a beginner has been fooled by going back exactly 3 weeks later, not finding any eggs, buying an expensive new queen, and then going back again and finding that there's a perfectly good queen in there. Don't expect them to have read the books and get everything going within 21 days from removing the final set of queen cells. Give them a couple of extra weeks. So what you've done in this manipulation is, on the day you found a colony full of queen cells, you've taken out the queen and a frame or 2 of brood and made up a nuke, and you've reduced the queen cells to 1. You've gone back 7 days later, removed excess queen cells, and now 28 days later, you've got a mated queen in your nuke and in your old colony. It's a good way of preventing swarming, but it does rely on those 2 things: taking the queen out from the other parts of the colony and controlling the queen cells. Now, a nucleus colony will probably need some feeding until it's got sufficient foragers and has drawn wax. And later, you're going to have to move a nucleus colony into a brood box if it gets bigger. But there are lots of uses for a nucleus colony. You could use it to unite a queen into a queenless colony, or give it away, or sell it. So that's one method of swarm control. Let's look at our principle number 1, the 3 parts of a colony, and look at another way of doing swarm control. Let's say removing the brood and nurse bees. So I'm going to do what's called an artificial swarm. I'm going to take the brood and nurse bees away from the flying bees and the queen. It's called a pagodon, and to do it, you need another complete hive, including frames of foundation, a feeder, and some syrup. And this is how we remove the brood. First of all, we go to our colony, and this is a good colony. It's got a queen excluder and 2 supers. The queen is in there, but also there are lots of queen cells. So, first of all, I'm going to take off these supers, and I'm going to move the old colony to a new site and put a whole new box of foundation on the old site. So the old site is where I'm going to make my artificial swarm. And I'm going to do that by moving the queen on a frame of foundation, which has got brood on, into the box of foundation. Basically, I've removed 2 or 3 frames from that box of foundation and moved the frame of brood and the queen in there. I think she's probably going to need some stores, so I'll move 2 frames of stores in there with her as well. And then I'll go through the old brood box, remove all the queen cells except for 1, and close those up. And then put in some foundation, both in the new artificial swarm on the old site and the old brood box on the new site. One, the artificial swarm on the old site has got the queen and all the flying bees will come back there. The old brood box has just got one queen cell in. And I'm going to put the queen excluder back. And in this case, I'll put the supers onto the artificial swarm, which is mostly foundation, but a couple of frames of stores, a frame of brood and a queen, and cover them up. And I'll also put the coverboard and roof onto the old brood, which has got one queen cell. Now, actually, I'm not sure it terribly matters. You could put the supers onto the old brood and feed the artificial swarm. Either way, the artificial swarm does need access to some food, either a flow or the supers or a contact feeder with a light syrup in, because they need to draw wax. Now, we've done our first principle of swarm control. We've removed the brood. But the next one, I'm not going to read those. The next one is still to come. There is a variation on this pattern, which is called the Hedden variation. You can see we've still got our artificial swarm on the old site with the two supers on, and the queen is in there with all the flyers. And after 7 days, you can move the old brood box to the other side in the hope that bees will fly back to the original colony. I don't bother with that, to be perfectly honest, but lots of people swear by it. But there is something else I'm going to do after 5 to 7 days. I'm going to make sure the colony only has one queen cell to raise, control those emergency cells. I'm going to go back into, actually, I go into both parts. The artificial swarm, it's quite possible that the colony, which was in swarming mode, will have made more queen cells on the frame that I put in there with the queen, if there were eggs or young larvae there. Or she might have laid more eggs and they might have made queen cells on those. So I always go back and check that part of the colony, but also the old brood. My chosen queen cell is in there, but also they will have made emergency cells. So I go back and remove them. Control your queen cells. Then after 7 days, what have you got? You've got your artificial swarm and you've got your queen cell in your old brood ready to hatch. And you leave them for 21 days and hopefully when you come back, you've got a mated queen. So these are our two principles. If we only remember those from today, I think that's a win. Remove one of the 3 components of the colony and make sure the colony only has one queen cell to raise. Control those emergency cells. Now, we know that swarms can throw casts. Casts are what a prime swarm usually contains the mated queen, but sometimes virgin queens with smaller quantities of bees will follow, and we call those casts. In artificial swarms, more than one queen cell can cause casts. If you lose casts, you lose bees and weaken your colony, and you annoy your neighbours. So to prevent casts, limit the number of queen cells, and you might want to use the Hedden variation, although I don't use it myself. Now, you might be thinking, well, it's all very well, this moving the brood, a couple of meters away from the original site, but I don't have a lot of space. Or maybe I'm running out of kit. I haven't got enough roofs. Okay, you could do something called the Demery method of swarm control. Now, the method of swarm control we just saw, the Pagden, produced essentially 2 colonies. The emphasis on the Demery method I'm going to show you is on producing one very large colony. So it doesn't make increase like the Pagden. but it works vertically on the same idea of an artificial swarm. Basically, on day one, when you find your queen cells, you might do a demarree. Now I'm going to do it with these boxes without with the queen cells in. So on the first day, you rearrange the colony like this. I have put a box of foundation on the old site with one frame of brood, which, remember, I checked carefully to make sure there were no queen cells. And I also put the queen in that bottom box. So down below, we've got on the old site exactly an artificial swarm. All the flyers are coming back there. There's one frame of brood and the queen, and all the rest is foundation or drawn comb. Then I've got a queen excluder and 2 supers. Now this colony had 2 supers when we started, but if it hadn't, I'd have put 2 supers of frames there anyway, because we're trying to create a space between the artificial swarm at the bottom and the old brood box, which I'm putting above another queen excluder on the top. That means that it's separated from the queen. So the flyers are still coming back to the old site, but the nurse bees are in the top with the queen cells and the frames of old brood. And you need to remove all the queen cells at the top. And you're left with this: artificial swarm at the bottom, queen excluder, 2 supers, queen excluder, old brood with no queen cells. And I think you know what I'm going to say by now. What is it we do 7 days later? We come back and remove any emergency queen cells they've made. And we're back to the bottom box. They're pulling it out. They're making more brood down below this artificial swarm, and the queen's still there. But all the flying bees are coming back to this colony, and all the nurse bees are up top too. It's a very strong colony for honey making. And this keeps all the flyers together, but separates the queen and the brood by 2 supers. And you may need to put another super in the middle there. You can see that there are some advantages and disadvantages to this. It stops swarming, but it's a strong colony and it will likely try again later in the season. Also, if you're like me, it's really heavy getting those brood boxes up high. And if you have to put 3 or 4 supers between the bottom box and the top box, it can be difficult. Okay, the other thing you might say to me is, all these things are really okay in theory, but I can never find the queen. Now, let's be honest, in beekeeping, you don't often have to find the queen, but it really helps if you can for swarm control. And I expect one of the first things you've been told is, if you can't find the queen, shake off the stores and remove them and pair up the remaining frames like in this picture. Leave them for 5 minutes for the light to get between them. And then what you do is you check, you pull out a pair of frames, open them up like a book, and the queen is most likely to be on the dark side. She's most likely to be between those pairs of frames, between the 2 frames in a pair. So you've got less surface area to check. But sometimes that doesn't work. If that doesn't work, we can do swarm control with or without queen cells by effectively sieving the bees. And I'm just going to show you how to do that. So, oh, I've got queen cells in this one. I was going to do it without queen cells, but never mind. You know your queen is in this box somewhere, right? It's got a queen excluder on and 2 supers. So it could be a box without queen cells like this. You know your queen's in there, but you can't for the life of you find her. First of all, you move the old brood off the original site just for a while and put a box of foundation on there. Now, as you can see, I've made a space. I've removed 2 frames of foundation. And what am I going to transfer in? Of course, I'm going to transfer in 1 frame of brood and the queen. Oh, I'm going to shake some nurse bees in. And the queen. And what I will end up with is this. In the bottom, I've got one frame of brood and the queen. And of course, all the flyers are coming back to it. But most of that bottom box is foundation. Then there's a queen excluder. And above the queen excluder, I've got the old brood. And above that, there's a queen excluder and the supers. But what's going to happen is that the queen is going to stay with that frame of brood in the bottom and all the flyers, but the nurse bees are going to move up and they're going to coat and tend those frames of brood. So after 24 hours, you can remove that upper brood box with all the nurse bees and brood in, and you can treat it like, you know, half of a pagden, and you have got your queen in the bottom box with a frame of brood and 10 frames of foundation. Effectively, what you did was you sieved the queen by keeping her in the bottom box. All the bees were in the bottom box, and the nurse bees went up to above. Let me run that by you again. I added a frame of brood and shook all the bees into that bottom box. Everyone. I even brushed out the bees from the old box before I reassembled it like this. So all the nurse bees then in the next 24 hours went up, and then I can take the brood and nurse bees away. Our basic principle of taking away one element of the colony. The queen, one frame of brood, all the flyers are left on the original site as an artificial swarm. Now, I showed that sieving without queen cells in. If there are queen cells, don't shake the frame. Brush the bees off with a clump of grass or your hand or a bee brush. Don't shake queen cells. But that old brood could be left to make queen cells or could be split into nuclei. Now, if you do all this, people are going to say, I don't want any more colonies. I keep making increase. Every time I do a pagden or take out a nuke, I've got another colony. Well, yes, but you can always unite colonies. So uniting colonies is simply a matter of choosing which queen you want to keep, and you can assess the colony. Depends what's most important to you, maybe temperament or productivity. And maybe towards the end of the season, you can unite 2 colonies to keep the best queen going into winter really powerful. So you don't have to keep doubling your numbers of colonies. Some people say, I'm running out of kit. What shall I do? Well, some of these swarm control methods use more kit than others. And this weekend, when I had 8 colonies to split, I found that after I'd done a couple of pagdens, I was running out of roofs and frames of foundation. So I did a demery and extracted 2 nukes. It was very effective. A demery doesn't demand an extra roof, and a nuke doesn't demand a whole extra hive. And some people resolutely say to me, if I just give my bees a lot more space, like a double brood box, that'll stop them swarming, won't it? No, it won't. Swarming is how bees reproduce. And if they did that, you know, if they stopped just because they've got space, they'd be extinct. So what are my top tips? Mark your queens. Oh, do it now, although the colonies are getting bigger. Put out a bait hive. Always interesting to see what you get. Remember, you don't have to double your numbers every year, but if you unite in the autumn, it's a great way of replacing your queens. Sometimes you might have a holiday coming up in the beekeeping season. I'm afraid my husband's been known to book holidays during the beekeeping season. If in that case, you don't have someone to go and do your swarm control, cheat. A Bailey comb change or a shook swarm slows a colony down and actually has benefits for disease prevention or varroa control. If your colonies swarm more than once a year, though, you either need to requeen with a less powerful queen, or perhaps give them more space. If you split your colony without queen cells, they're going to need eggs. But always make sure you only have one queen cell growing 5 to 7 days after you split a colony. If you leave it 8 or 9, it will be too late. If you do it before 4, you won't see the emergency cells, not all of them. Don't just follow the rules, think like a bee. Remember those numbers, 4, 8, 16. Think, what does the colony want? Try to collect your swarms. Don't be a nuisance to your neighbours, and try and be the beekeeper you wish had helped you at the beginning. When I was young, we considered it very unlucky to buy or sell bees, and it's still a great gift to a beginner to give them a swarm. And remember, every queen cell is potentially a new queen. All you need to know is that to manage swarm control, you need to remove one of the 3 components of the colony. Make sure the colony only has one queen cell to raise and control emergency cells. And remember your numbers, 4, 8, 16. And if you want more advice, David Evans' blog, theapiarist.org, is absolutely brilliant. Both the BBKA Guide to Beekeeping and the Haynes Manual are really good books. The BBKA Guide to Beekeeping is more comprehensive, and there's lots of good advice on BeeBase at the National Bee Unit. Thank you. I hope that's useful, and I wonder if we have any questions.
Thank you very much, Jane. That was excellent. I haven't seen any questions in the chat yet.
Do I stop sharing? Stop sharing.
There we go.
When you say you remove the queens, I mean, what do you do? Pull them out and squash them or something? Or sorry, it's a really naive question.
No, it's a really good question. It's the sort of things we assume. If I'm going in at the first time, I'm going to choose a queen cell that's not sticking out too much so it's going to get knocked off, that I can see a nice juicy grub in. It's always best to choose a queen cell where you can see the larva.
Right.
And you want to see that it's on some royal jelly, but you don't want it to get knocked off. So choose a good queen cell, and the others you can literally squish off with your fingers. If you don't want them, you just destroy them.
Okay, right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dan Forster's got his hand up.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Lovely. So thank you very much for the presentation. Really, really interesting. I'm in my 2nd season, so I'm still new. I've got swarm cells. I've just done a split into a nuke using the method that you described, the first one. There's nothing moving in or out of my nucleus hive. I didn't put grass in or anything. Is that normal or not?
It's awfully cold. Will you come out in this weather?
Well, I do come out because I have to go and look after my bees and make sure they're okay. But yeah.
Did you feed them, Dan?
Yeah, I've fed them. So I've got a poly nuke and I filled up. So this was on Saturday. I filled up with syrup on Saturday, and when I went back today, it was all gone. So they are feeding. I've looked inside. There's plenty of bees in there. There's just nothing moving in or out of the hive, and I just that the hive. So the original parent colony is next door, and that's just absolutely booming. It's like Heathrow Airport. But the nuke is just sat there with nothing moving, and I just wondered.
Well, think about it. All the flying bees have gone back to that original colony, haven't they?
Yeah.
So what's left in your nuke is the nurse bees who haven't flown. I would at least turn that nuke round, preferably put it a little away from the parent colony, so that when those nurse bees become flyers, they orientate to the nuke.
Yeah.
But I really honestly wouldn't be worried at this point because they are nurse bees. Nurse bees haven't been outside the colony before. So they will just be feeding, maturing, tending that queen and building up. Remember, they may have wax to pull out as well.
Yeah, so they have started drawing out the frames, I've noticed. So yeah, they are busy in there, just nothing moving at the moment. But thank you, I appreciate that.
Keep feeding them in this weather because it's really very cold. And
Yeah.
if they're drawing out wax in this weather, they're doing super well because it's really too cold for it at the moment where I am.
Yeah, okay. I'm down in the southwest. I'm near Bristol, so it's the sun is actually shining today, but it is, you're right, it is a little bit cold.
We've got Elizabeth next.
Hi, yeah. I just wondered, both those methods, do they require the queen cells not to be capped?
Yes, if the queen cells are capped, I would say there's a 90% chance that the swarm has left. Okay.
Okay.
If the queen cells are capped, it's probably a bit late. If the queen cells are capped, I would choose a really nice looking queen cell. Is there a really nice looking uncapped queen cell you could choose?
I've got both. I've got a capped one and an uncapped one that had a big sort of juicy larva in it.
Right, take down the capped one.
Okay.
Leave the uncapped one. Go back in 5 to 7 days, as I said, and check that they haven't made more queen cells. But mark the frame that your uncapped queen cell is on, so you know where to look for it, either with your queen marking pen or with a drawing pin.
Yep.
You've probably lost your swarm. It's possible in the very cold weather that they're holding back, but
Yeah.
unlikely. I think you've probably lost your swarm, but you don't want to lose any casts. So go back, take off the capped one, keep the uncapped one, and make sure they don't build any more.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there seemed to be a huge amount of bees in there the other day, even though we had the capped one, but that's never a sign that they haven't already swarmed, I believe.
It isn't, because, they're really in full lay at the moment.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you for the talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Deborah next, if you unmute.
Hi, first of all, Jane, thank you so much for the great presentation. I've got a quick question. It's regarding the use of a snail growth board. Would you recommend a snail growth board like the Pagden method, but vertically?
Are your bees in your garden?
Yes.
If your bees are in your garden and you want to use a snail growth board, it's very effective. It's a bit more complicated. And you have to go out to them every 4 days to open and shut little doors.
Yes.
If you're confident with a Pagden, I would say you could move on to a snail grove. It is quite fun and it does work, but I would make sure that I was fully confident with a Pagden before I did so.
Yeah, I'm an experienced beekeeper. I just wondered whether the snail growth board is actually a better way of doing Pagden, because with Pagden you're moving it physically around where you haven't got space. With the snail grove you're doing the same thing but vertically, aren't you?
Upwards, yeah. And a snail growth board works really well. What it does is it sort of draws the bees down. But yes, it works very well. It just requires more visits. And even with the snail grove, remembering to keep control of those new queen cells is absolutely vital.
Yeah, I've just invested in a snail growth board from the Spring Convention, so I will be trying that out later.
Both snail grove and Horsley boards work really well, but all they are is a development on the artificial swarm concept.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question for Jane. That's from Arlene. Please, if you unmute.
Thank you, Jane. That was really informative. Thank you very much. So I had 2 colonies got through the winter really well. And then I had to go away because my brother passed away. So I had to go away in February. And when I got back, one of them wasn't active, and I was like, oh no, one of them starved, because I did have loads of stores on, but they were doing so well. I think they just gobbled up all of the honey. So then the other one, which was strong, I tried to split, and I tried to do the method you said, but I couldn't find the queen. So I shifted one brood box onto the old site. In fact, what I did was 2 brood box initially, so that the queen that was there could lay into both. Then I put the new, moved the old box over to one site, shifted the new box onto the old site, and left them for a week. And then I've shifted them the other side. And then when I looked through, the queen was in the other one, in the new site. But they're both really, really strong. And I didn't get this weekend. I looked through, I couldn't find her on the new site, but I know she's there because there's eggs and laying and all doing well. But on the old site, I didn't open up because I thought, oh well, I'm going to leave them alone to just get on with it. And there were 2 queen cells in there before. So I was like, I'm thinking,
Right.
oh no.
So you've got your old box with the queen in that you've moved. It's got the brood and the queen, yeah?
Yeah.
So you've separated the brood and the queen from the flyers.
Yeah.
So I would check that box again to make sure there are no new queen cells, but I think you should be fine on that old box.
Yeah.
On the new box, the new box is on the old site, yeah?
Yeah.
What will happen is the flyers will all come back to there.
Yeah.
And the nurse bees there will draw out queen cells from whatever genetic material they've got in there. So you need to go in as soon as possible and reduce those queen cells to 1.
To 1. Okay. Yeah.
And then you'll be able to leave them for 3 weeks, possibly 4, and another queen will get mated.
Okay, brilliant.
It is vital to go and reduce the queen cells now.
Yeah, because when I looked last week, there were 2 queen cells in there, but this weekend I didn't look in, so I'm like, oh God, because if you're talking about the 4 and the 8 and the 16.
Well, you just don't want casts. You don't want 3 or 4 little swarms, do you? Because that it's a bit of a mess.
Yeah.
So I would just go in as soon as you can and reduce those queen cells. She may have hatched.
Yes.
Don't ever mark a virgin queen though.
No.
If there's a virgin in there, just leave her. You'll know she's little and quick. But don't mark a virgin queen.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. It's so helpful.
Hey, they're very resilient. We learn by trying things out.
Yes. How many years later and I'm still learning every year.
Me too.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Jane. That was absolutely excellent. Before I introduce our next speaker, one of the reasons for us doing a swarm evening this year was the huge amount of social media attention swarms got last year. BBKA had lots and lots of phone call inquiries from newspapers, and I think even the TV asked about it. Could we explain why there were so many swarms? So that's one of the reasons we're having tonight's talk. But now I'd like to introduce